Late one October evening, as the crisp autumn air whispered through the small New England town, Ellie Morgan pulled her coat tighter around herself and hurried down the dimly lit street toward her apartment. She loved her walks home from the local coffee shop where she worked, the quiet town streets, the crunch of leaves beneath her boots, and the occasional glow of a Jack O' lantern on a porch made her feel comforted. But tonight, something felt different. It began a few days ago when Ellie noticed the man. He was nondescript, average height, brown jacket, a knit cap pulled low over his face. At first, she assumed he was just another customer lingering at the coffee shop. But then she saw him again, standing by the crosswalk as she left for the night. The next morning, she spotted him leaning against a lamppost across the street from her building. He never approached, never spoke. He just watched. Ellie shook off her unease, convincing herself it was just a coincidence. Tonight, however, the feeling of being watched grew heavier. As Ellie passed the small bookstore on Main Street, she saw a reflection in the glass, a figure walking several paces behind her. Her heart jumped. She sped up, her boots clicking faster against the pavement. The figure matched her pace. She turned sharply into a side alley, hoping to lose him. The shortcut would take her to her building faster, but the narrow path was shadowed and eerily silent. She glanced over her shoulder. No one was there. Relief washed over her, but as she approached the alley's exit, a shape emerged from the darkness ahead. It was him. "Hey!" Ellie shouted, trying to sound braver than she felt. "What do you want?" The man didn't respond. He just stood there, his face obscured by the shadows. Ellie's pulse thundered in her ears. Slowly, she backed away, clutching her keys like a weapon. Without warning, the man sprinted toward her. Ellie turned and ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She darted out of the alley and back onto the main street, nearly colliding with a couple walking their dog. The man was gone. Shaking, Ellie thanked the couple for their concern and hurried home. She triple-locked her door, drawing the curtains tight. Safe inside, she tried to convince herself it was just a misunderstanding, a random stranger who meant no harm. But deep down, she knew better. The next few days were quiet, almost too quiet. Ellie saw no sign of the man. She began to hope he'd moved on, until the note appeared. It was a plain piece of paper slipped under her door. The message, scrawled in uneven handwriting, made her blood run cold. "You're beautiful when you're scared." Ellie called the police immediately. An officer came by, took her statement, and assured her they'd keep an eye out, but without any evidence or a clear threat, there wasn't much they could do. That night, Ellie barely slept. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind rattling the window pane made her jump. Around 3 a.m., her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "I can see you." Her heart stopped. She stared at the message, paralyzed. Then, summoning every ounce of courage she had, she grabbed a kitchen knife and checked every room in her apartment. Nothing. No one. But when she looked out her bedroom window, she saw him standing on the sidewalk below, staring up at her. Ellie didn't sleep again that night. By morning, she decided to stay with a friend across town until she felt safe. She packed a bag and called a cab. As she left her building, she glanced down the street, half expecting to see him. He wasn't there. She sighed with relief and climbed into the cab. As the car pulled away, Ellie looked out the back window. In the distance, standing on the corner, was the man. He raised a hand in a slow, mocking wave. At her friend's house, Ellie tried to relax. They called the police again, and this time, the officers seemed more concerned. They promised to increase patrols near her apartment. That night, she and her friend stayed up watching movies, trying to drown out the fear. Around midnight, Ellie's phone buzzed again. This time, the message was a photo, taken from outside her friend's house. Panic set in. They called the police again, but by the time officers arrived, the man was gone. The photos didn't show his face, just blurry shots of the house and the surrounding area. The police advised Ellie to stay somewhere else, maybe even leave town for a while. She agreed. The next morning, Ellie boarded a bus to her parents' house, several hours away. She felt safer knowing she was putting distance between herself and the stalker. For the first time in days, she began to relax. But as the bus pulled into her hometown, her phone buzzed one last time. The message was a single word.
Story number 2.
Mia Aldridge always took the same route home from her late-night shifts at the diner. It was a well-lit path that passed through a quiet suburban neighborhood. Nothing ever happened there, until one particular night when everything changed. It started with the sound of footsteps. Mia had just clocked out and was walking briskly down the sidewalk, her breath visible in the chilly air. The rhythmic beat of her shoes on the pavement was accompanied by a faint echo, someone else's steps, just out of sync with her own. She stopped and looked back. The street was empty. Probably just my imagination, she muttered, clutching her purse tighter and continuing on her way. The footsteps returned, louder this time, but when she turned again, no one was there. The feeling of being watched prickled her skin. She hurried home, her heart pounding, and locked the door behind her. For the next few days, the eerie sensation persisted. At work, she noticed a man sitting in a booth near the corner of the diner. He didn't order much, just a coffee, and stayed for hours, watching her. He had a scruffy beard, hollow cheeks, and eyes that never left her. "Do you know him?" her coworker Jenna whispered one evening, nodding toward the man. "No," Maya replied, shivering. Jenna frowned. "He gives me the creeps. Want me to say something?" Mia shook her head. "I don't want to make a scene. He'll leave eventually." But he didn't. Night after night, the man returned. He always sat in the same booth, ordered the same coffee, and stared. When Mia's shift ended, he'd be gone, but she'd feel the weight of unseen eyes as she walked home. One night, as she locked up the diner, she saw him across the street, standing perfectly still beneath a flickering street lamp. Her stomach flipped. "Hey!" she called out, trying to sound confident. "What do you want?" The man didn't answer. He simply tilted his head as if studying her. Mia's fight-or-flight instincts kicked in, and she chose flight, sprinting the rest of the way home. When she reached her door, she risked a glance back. The man hadn't followed her, but she could swear she saw his silhouette in the distance, framed by the glow of the streetlight. She didn't sleep that night. The next day, Mia reported the man to the police. An officer came by the diner and spoke with her. "Do you know his name or where he lives?" he asked. "No," Mia said, frustrated. "But he's been watching me for days." "We'll keep an eye out," the officer assured her, but his tone was nonchalant, as if this were just another minor complaint. That evening, Mia felt a false sense of security, thinking the police would handle it. But as she walked home, she saw something that froze her in place. Scrawled in red spray paint across the side of her apartment building were the words, "Shh, I see you." Her knees buckled. The man knew where she lived. Mia called the police again, and this time they sent a patrol car to her building. But the officers didn't seem concerned. "Probably just some kids messing around," one said with a shrug. Mia knew better. The following night, she stayed at a friend's house. She didn't want to be alone, not after what she'd seen. But around 2 a.m., her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "You shouldn't have left. You shouldn't have left." Her blood turned to ice. She showed the message to her friend, who insisted they call the police again. The officers promised to investigate, but Mia felt like they were brushing her off. The next day, she returned to her apartment to grab a few things. The air inside felt heavy, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. She went to her bedroom and stopped cold. On her bed was a single object, her favorite scarf, neatly folded. Mia hadn't been home in over 24 hours. The police finally took her seriously after that. They found no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing to prove someone had been inside. But Mia knew the truth. She stayed with her parents for a while, hoping to feel safe again. But the texts continued. Each one was more unsettling than the last. "Nice dress. I like your hair like that. You looked so peaceful sleeping last night." Mia blocked the number, but the messages always found their way back. One night, weeks later, she woke to a sound outside her bedroom window. A soft scraping, like nails on glass. She didn't move, didn't breathe. Slowly, she turned her head toward the window. The man was there, his face pressed against the glass, grinning. Mia screamed, and the lights in her parents' house flicked on. By the time her father ran outside, the man was gone. Mia never saw him again after that, but the damage was done. She moved to another state, changed her number, and quit her job. But every so often, when she's alone in a quiet room, she feels the familiar weight of unseen eyes. And sometimes, just sometimes, she swears she can hear footsteps.
Story number 3.
Lena Carter had just moved into a new apartment, a modest studio on the 4th floor of an old building in the city. It wasn't much, but it was affordable and hers. She liked the creaky wood floors, the large windows overlooking the street, and the clawfoot tub in the bathroom. It felt like a fresh start. The first few nights were uneventful, save for the occasional noises from her neighbors. Thin walls, she figured. She'd often hear muffled voices, footsteps above, and the faint hum of a TV from the unit next door. It was a little noisy, but nothing she couldn't handle. Then the tapping started. It was faint at first. Just a soft, irregular tap, tap, tap on her window. Lena dismissed it as branches brushing against the glass. But when she looked out, there were no trees near her window, only the sheer drop to the alley below. The tapping came again the next night. This time it was louder and more persistent. Lena, unnerved, pulled back the curtain and peered into the darkness. Nothing. Just the empty street lit by a flickering lamppost. Old buildings make weird noises, she told herself, trying to shake the creeping unease. But the tapping didn't stop. By the third night, it was no longer confined to her window. She heard it on the walls, the ceiling, even the floor. A maddening, rhythmic pattern that seemed to follow her no matter where she stood in the apartment. That's when the notes began to appear. The first one was on her kitchen counter, written in neat, blocky handwriting, "I like your hair." Lena froze, staring at the note. She hadn't left it there. No one had been in her apartment. She checked the door, still locked. The windows, all shut tight. She tried to convince herself it was a prank, but deep down, she knew better. The second note arrived 2 days later, pinned to her bathroom mirror. "You hum when you're nervous." Her heart raced. She had a habit of humming when she was anxious, something she'd never consciously noticed until now. Lena called the building manager, demanding he check the locks and inspect her apartment. He came up, looked around, and found nothing unusual. "No signs of a break-in," he said with a shrug. "Maybe you're just stressed. Moving can do that to people." Lena didn't buy it, but what could she do? That night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding at every creak and groan of the old building. The tapping returned, louder than ever, but she refused to look. She curled up under her blanket, clutching her phone like a lifeline. Around 2 a.m., she received a text from an unknown number. "Why don't you ever smile at the window?" Lena's blood ran cold. Her hands trembled as she dialed 911, whispering to the dispatcher that someone was stalking her. The police arrived within minutes, checked the apartment, and found no sign of an intruder. "It's probably a prank," one of the officers said, though his expression betrayed doubt. "Change your locks," the other suggested. Lena did exactly that the next morning, hiring a locksmith to install a deadbolt and a chain. She bought a security camera and set it up to face her front door. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sliver of control. That night, as she reviewed the camera footage before bed, her heart nearly stopped. The feed showed her front door, perfectly still, until around 3 a.m. when the chain began to move on its own. Slowly, methodically, as if someone were testing its strength. Lena didn't sleep that night. The final straw came 3 days later. She returned home from work to find her apartment eerily silent. No tapping, no creaks, just a suffocating stillness. She walked into her bedroom and stopped dead in her tracks. On her pillow was a single Polaroid photograph. It was a picture of her, taken from outside her window. In the photo, she was sitting on her bed, staring at her phone, completely unaware. Lena grabbed the picture and ran to a friend's house, too terrified to spend another second in that apartment. She called the police again, but the investigation turned up nothing. Lena moved out the next day, leaving behind everything but a suitcase of clothes. Weeks later, she received a package at her new address. No return label, no note inside, just a single Polaroid. It was another photo of her, taken through the window of her new apartment.
Story number 4.
It was a little past midnight when Claire's phone buzzed. She was half asleep, curled up on her couch with an old horror movie playing in the background. Groggily, she reached for her phone and saw the message. "You forgot to lock your door." Claire's heart stopped. Her eyes darted to the front door, just a few feet away. It was closed. Slowly, she got up, trying to ignore the rising panic in her chest. Her fingers trembled as she checked the lock. Secure. She stared at the message again. It was from an unknown number. "Not funny," she texted back. A response came almost instantly. "Look again." Claire's breath hitched. She turned to the door, dread clawing at her stomach. Her fingers hesitated before touching the lock again. It turned easily in her hand. The door had been unlocked. Her mind raced. She always locked her door. She knew she had locked it tonight. Adrenaline coursing through her veins, she slammed the lock shut and slid the chain across for extra measure. Then she grabbed a kitchen knife and backed away, her eyes fixed on the door as if it might spring open on its own. Her phone buzzed again. "Nice knife. But it won't help." Claire's blood ran cold. She spun around, scanning the room. She was alone, wasn't she? The apartment was small, a living room, a kitchen, a bathroom, and a single bedroom. There were no closets large enough to hide in, no dark corners for anyone to lurk. "I'm calling the police," she texted, her hands shaking. Another response came immediately. "Go ahead. They'll never find me." Her heart thundered in her chest. With trembling hands, she dialed 911 and explained the situation to the operator. "Someone's harassing me," she whispered, her voice barely steady. "They might be in my apartment." "Stay on the line," the operator said. "Officers are on their way." Claire didn't hang up. She clutched the phone in one hand and the knife in the other, her back pressed against the wall. She stared at the door, her ears straining for any sound. Minutes dragged by like hours. Then she heard it, a faint creak from her bedroom. Claire froze. She hadn't been in the bedroom since she got home. The door had been open earlier, but now it was slightly ajar. Her stomach churned with terror. "Someone's here," she whispered into the phone. "Stay calm," the operator replied. "Help is almost there." Claire couldn't stay still. If someone was in her apartment, she couldn't just wait for them to come out. With her phone still pressed to her ear, she crept toward the bedroom, her knife raised. Her other hand pushed the door open, inch by inch. The room was dark, but nothing seemed out of place. The bed was unmade, her clothes were strewn across the floor, and the window was shut. She flicked on the light and scanned every corner. Nothing. Her phone buzzed again, startling her. This time the message was a photo. It was a picture of her, taken from behind. She was holding the knife, standing in her bedroom doorway, just seconds ago. Claire's scream caught in her throat as she spun around, but no one was there. The sound of sirens outside was the only thing that broke the suffocating silence. Moments later, there was a knock at her door. "Police!" She ran to the door and threw it open, relief flooding her as two officers stepped inside. She explained everything, showing them the messages and the photo. The officers searched the apartment thoroughly, but they found no sign of anyone. The windows were locked from the inside, and there was no forced entry. One of the officers suggested it might have been a hacker playing a cruel joke, but Claire wasn't convinced. She stayed with a friend that night, too afraid to return to her apartment. The next morning, when she went back to pack her things, she found something that made her stomach lurch. Scratched into the wall behind her couch were the words, "You're fun to watch." Claire never stepped foot in that apartment again.
Story number 5.
Jenna worked the night shift at a gas station on the edge of town. It was quiet, uneventful work. She'd her nights restocking shelves, flipping through her phone, and serving the occasional customer. The hours between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. were always the loneliest, with nothing but the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional truck rumbling down the highway to keep her company. That's when the man started coming in. At first, he seemed normal enough, a middle-aged guy in a weathered coat and a baseball cap. He came in every few nights, bought a pack of gum or a soda, and left without saying much. But after a few weeks, Jenna noticed he was coming more often. Too often. Every night, around the same time, he'd walk through the glass doors, his boots echoing on the tile floor. He'd linger near the snack aisle, not buying anything, just watching her. Jenna tried to ignore him, but his presence made her skin crawl. His gaze was heavy, unblinking, like he was trying to memorize every detail of her face. One night, he walked up to the counter and placed a single candy bar down. "You've got a nice smile," he said, his voice low and raspy. Jenna forced a polite laugh, ringing him up as quickly as possible. "Thanks." He didn't leave immediately. Instead, he stood there, staring at her, his mouth twitching into a crooked grin. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he said before turning and walking out the door. From that night on, Jenna became hyper-aware of everything. She started noticing things. Footsteps outside the gas station, faint shadows moving just beyond the glow of the parking lot lights, the feeling of being watched even when the store was empty. One night, as she cleaned the coffee station, she glanced up at the security cameras. She froze. The monitor showed the man standing outside, just beyond the glass doors. He wasn't moving, wasn't trying to come in. He was just standing there, staring directly at the camera. Her heart raced. She grabbed her phone and called her manager. "Hey, there's this guy outside and he's weird," she stammered. "Lock the doors and call the police," her manager said. Jenna hung up and rushed to the doors, flipping the lock. When she looked outside again, the man was gone. The police arrived 20 minutes later. By then, the parking lot was empty. They checked the security footage, but the strange part was there was no man on the tape. The timestamp showed the moment Jenna had seen him, but the cameras only showed an empty lot. Could have been a glitch, one of the officers suggested, but Jenna knew what she'd seen. The following night, Jenna debated calling in sick, but she needed the money. She spent the entire shift on edge, jumping at every sound. Around 3 a.m., the automatic doors slid open. She spun around, her stomach sinking. It was him. He didn't walk to the counter this time. Instead, he wandered the aisles, his fingers brushing against the shelves as he moved. "Can I help you?" Jenna called out, trying to keep her voice steady. He didn't answer. He stopped near the back of the store, just out of view of the counter. "Sir?" She tried again, taking a hesitant step toward him. The lights flickered, plunging the store into momentary darkness. When they came back on, he was gone. Jenna felt a cold sweat break out on her neck. She checked the aisles, the bathroom, even the storage room. He wasn't there. When she returned to the counter, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A piece of paper, folded neatly, was sitting next to the register. Her hands shook as she opened it. The note was scrawled in uneven handwriting. "You can lock the doors, but I can still get in." Jenna called the police again, but there wasn't much they could do. They offered to send an officer to sit in the parking lot for the rest of her shift, but Jenna refused. She quit the next morning. She moved on, got a new job in another town, and tried to forget about the man. But the fear lingered. She double-checked every lock, kept her windows covered, and avoided working nights. Months later, Jenna found herself unpacking boxes in her new apartment. She opened a kitchen drawer and froze. Sitting inside, neatly folded, was a piece of paper. She opened it with trembling hands. The message was simple. "Found you."
Story number 6.
It was an unassuming package that arrived on Sarah's doorstep. Brown cardboard sealed with clear tape, no return address. At first, she thought it was a delivery mix-up, but the label had her name and address written in a neat, unfamiliar script. She hadn't ordered anything. Curiosity got the better of her. She brought the box inside, setting it on the kitchen counter. It was surprisingly light. With a knife, she carefully sliced through the tape. Inside was a single item wrapped in layers of tissue paper, an old Polaroid camera. She held it up, inspecting its vintage design. A note fluttered to the counter as she unwrapped it. It read, "Take a picture. You'll love what you see." Sarah shivered. The handwriting was elegant, almost too perfect, like it had been copied from a template. She considered throwing the camera away, but hesitated. It looked harmless, just an old, dusty relic from decades past. That night, as she got ready for bed, the camera sat on her nightstand, its bulky lens pointed at the ceiling. She told herself it was silly to feel uneasy. It was just a camera. At 2:36 a.m., she woke with a jolt. The sound of a click echoed in the darkness, followed by a mechanical whirr. She turned on her bedside lamp, her heart pounding. The camera had taken a picture. A fresh Polaroid was slowly sliding out of its slot. Trembling, Sarah picked it up. The image was grainy, but it was unmistakable. Her bedroom, captured in black and white. She stared at the photo. It wasn't just her room. There was something else, someone else, in the frame. A figure stood in the corner, their outline faint but unmistakable. She gasped, dropping the photo. The corner where the figure had been was empty. Sarah grabbed the camera and shoved it into a box, sealing it with duct tape. She left it in the hallway and spent the rest of the night with every light in the apartment turned on. The next morning, she drove the box to a dumpster several blocks away, relieved to be rid of it. That night, as she sat on her couch watching TV, her phone buzzed with a text. It was from an unknown number. "You shouldn't have done that." Her blood ran cold. She tried to call the number, but it went straight to voicemail. A minute later, another text came through. "Check your front door." Against her better judgment, Sarah peeked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. Cautiously, she unlocked the door and opened it a crack. Sitting on the floor in front of her was the camera. She slammed the door shut, her hands shaking. The duct tape she'd used to seal the box was still intact. Another text came through. "Take a picture, Sarah." She didn't sleep that night. The following day, she called her friend Megan, explaining everything. "You need to get rid of it," Megan insisted. "Burn it, smash it, whatever it takes. Just get rid of it for good." Desperate, Sarah agreed. She drove to an isolated field that night, camera in hand. She doused it in lighter fluid and lit a match. The flames roared to life, consuming the camera. Sarah watched until it was nothing but a pile of blackened plastic and ashes. She felt a sense of relief as she drove home. The nightmare was over. But when she stepped into her apartment, the air felt wrong, heavy, oppressive. On her kitchen counter was a Polaroid photo, fresh and glossy. Her hands shook as she picked it up. The photo showed her standing in the field, watching the camera burn. Behind her, in the shadows, was the same figure from the first photo, now much closer. The last text came seconds later. "You can't get rid of me."
Story number 7.
Tom had never liked the old mirror in the hallway of his family's farmhouse. It was massive, with a thick, ornate wooden frame that seemed to swallow the light around it. His grandmother had always called it an heirloom, passed down through generations. She would polish it every morning, muttering to herself, though Tom could never quite catch the words. When his grandmother passed away, the farmhouse was left to Tom. He moved in reluctantly, feeling a strange unease in the empty halls. The mirror, though covered in a fine layer of dust, still dominated the hallway. One night, as Tom was heading to bed, he noticed something strange. He paused in front of the mirror, wiping his hand across the glass to clear a smudge. For a fleeting second, his reflection didn't move with him. He froze, staring at the mirror. His reflection stood perfectly still, its eyes locked onto his, an almost imperceptible smirk playing on its lips. Tom blinked, and the reflection moved again, mimicking him perfectly. "It's just my mind playing tricks," he muttered, shaking off the creeping dread. But the incidents didn't stop. The next day, as Tom passed the mirror on his way to the kitchen, he noticed something out of place. In the reflection, the door to the living room was slightly ajar, though it was firmly shut in reality. Tom tested it, opening and closing the door, watching as the reflection continued to lag behind, showing glimpses of the room as though someone had just been there. That night, as he lay in bed, he heard faint whispers coming from the hallway. He strained to listen, his breath catching in his throat. The whispers were soft, almost melodic, but the words were incomprehensible. Gathering his courage, Tom crept to the hallway, the wooden floorboards groaning under his weight. The mirror loomed in the dim light, its surface shimmering faintly. "Hello," he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. The mirror answered. It wasn't an echo or his imagination. A voice, distorted and hollow, came from the glass. "Tom," he stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. The surface of the mirror rippled like water, and for a moment he saw something behind his reflection. Dark, shadowy figures moving in the background. Tom bolted back to his room, tense, locking the door and shoving a chair under the knob for good measure. He didn't sleep that night, his eyes fixed on the sliver of light under the door. The next morning, Tom decided he'd had enough. He grabbed a blanket and draped it over the mirror, covering it completely. Out of sight, out of mind, he thought. But the whispers didn't stop. That night, they were louder, insistent. They seemed to come from everywhere, echoing through the house. Tom tried to block them out, burying his head under his pillow, but it was no use. Around 3 a.m., there was a loud crash. Tom shot out of bed, his pulse racing. He crept into the hallway, his stomach sinking as he saw the blanket lying on the floor. The mirror was uncovered, its surface cracked but intact. The reflection wasn't his anymore. In the glass, a figure stared back at him, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. It raised a hand, beckoning him forward. Tom backed away, but his feet didn't move. His body felt heavy, as though invisible hands were pulling him closer to the mirror. "No," he screamed, struggling against the force. The last thing he saw was of the figure reaching out, its long, clawed hand emerging from the glass. The next morning, the farmhouse was empty. Neighbors eventually called the authorities, who found no trace of Tom. The only clue was the mirror, now shattered into dozens of pieces, each shard reflecting an empty hallway. Or so they thought. If you looked closely, you could see a faint image in the largest shard, a man, screaming silently, trapped forever in the glass.
Story number 8.
Emily loved hiking. It was her escape from the noise of the city, a chance to lose herself in the peace of the forest. She often ventured out alone, trekking deep into trails where few others dared to go. One chilly autumn afternoon, she decided to explore a new trail she had read about online. The path was unmarked, winding through dense woods. The air was crisp, and the sunlight filtered through the golden leaves, creating a warm, inviting glow. At first, it was perfect. She relished the solitude, the sound of her boots crunching on the leaf-covered path, the occasional rustle of animals darting through the underbrush. But after a couple of hours, the trail began to change. The trees grew taller, their branches twisting together overhead, blocking out the sun. The air turned colder, and the cheerful sounds of birdsong disappeared, replaced by an oppressive silence. Emily glanced at her watch. It was only 4 p.m., but it felt much later. The daylight seemed to drain faster than it should. She paused, pulling out her phone to check the GPS. No signal. That was when she noticed the footprints. They weren't hers. They were larger, heavier, and recent. They led off the trail, disappearing into the thick brush. A chill ran down her spine. She hadn't seen anyone else all day. Probably a hunter, she muttered to herself, though the words didn't comfort her. She pressed on, quickening her pace, but the feeling of being watched clung to her. Every few steps, she'd glance over her shoulder, expecting to see someone, or something, lurking in the shadows. An hour later, she realized she was lost. The trail had disappeared entirely, swallowed by the forest. Panic bubbled in her chest as she tried to retrace her steps, but every tree looked the same. As dusk settled, Emily pulled out her flashlight, the beam cutting through the growing darkness. Her breaths came faster, her nerves on edge. That's when she heard it, a low, guttural whistle. It wasn't the sound of the wind or a bird. It was deliberate, human, and it came from somewhere ahead of her. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. No response. The whistle came again, closer this time. Emily's heart raced. She turned, trying to run back the way she came, but her legs felt leaden, her breath catching in her throat. She stumbled, her flashlight flickering as it hit the ground. Scrambling to pick it up, she froze. In the beam of light, just beyond the edge of the trees, she saw a figure. It stood perfectly still, shrouded in shadow. Its face was hidden, but she could feel its eyes on her. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand and pointed to something behind her. Emily didn't want to turn around to attack, but she couldn't stop herself. Slowly, she twisted her neck, the flashlight shaking in her grip. There was nothing there. When she turned back, the figure was gone. Emily ran. She didn't care where she was going. She just needed to get away. The trees blurred around her as she stumbled through the forest, her lungs burning. The whistle came again, this time from the left, then the right, then all around her. "Stop!" she screamed, tears streaming down her face. The whistling stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a voice, low, gravelly, and impossibly close, whispered in her ear, "Wrong trail." Emily spun around, but there was no one there. She didn't remember much after that. The next thing she knew, she was stumbling out of the forest and onto a dirt road where a passing car found her. When the police questioned her, she told them everything, but they found no footprints, no signs of anyone else in the woods. Emily never went hiking alone again. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, she swears she can hear that whistle outside her window.